1,000 years later.
2,000 years later. 3,000 years later.
4,000 years later. 5,000 years later. 6,000 years later.
7,000 years later.
7,500 years later. 8,000 years later. It's over! 9,000 years later. 10,000 years later.
12,000 years later. 15,000 years later. 20,000 years later. 21,000 years later. 25,000 years later. 30,000 years later. 35,000 years later. 37,000 years later. 40,000 years later. 40,340 years later. 45,000 years later. 47,000 years later.
4,900 years later.
50,000 years later. 55,000 years later. 56,000 years later. 60,000 years later. 64,400 years later. 70,000 years later. 7 minutes 37 seconds later. 75,000 years later. 75,200 years later. 75,400 years later. 80,000 years later. 85,000 years later. 87,000 years later. 90,000 hours later. 90,000 years later. Over 90,000 years later. 95,000 years later. 100,000 years later. 104,000 years later. 140,050 hours later. 450,000 years later. 1,000,000 years later. 6,000,000 years later. 7,500,000 years later. 10,000,000 years later. 12,000,000 years later. 14,000,000 years later. 15,000,000 years later. 16,000,000 years later. 85,625 trillion years later.